Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson. It's my pleasure to have with us tonight my colleague, a young man of great promise, should I say, great promise. I don't know if I go much past that, but at least a lot of promise there. And Harry Gross is in charge of research at the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. Now, I think we've discussed this before, Harry. It's fair to say that you share the opinions of the Democratic Party in many ways.
To some degree.
To many ways you share this. And we're sort of keeping our eye on the way the world goes, and substantial events are taking place with the new president. All kinds of new policies are put there, just a fire hose of new things happening. And many of these have a transformative impact on our country, for good and bad. And one of the issues I think that we could just talk about tonight would be about tariffs. And I will just make a comment or two about them. So certainly in the past, going back to the 18th century or maybe even before, the idea was if a country or an entity sold more than it bought from another country, it would accumulate gold and thus power. And so that would be, people would try and do that. And there's a mercantile policy. Maybe a country would try and obtain colonies in order to get sugar or tobacco or whatever they could get and not have to trade with other countries. And they would also try and keep their colonies aligned with the mother country. So there'd be sort of competing global economic entities, each attempting to buy more than they sold, or sold more than they bought, sold more than they bought, that's right. And so this went on, and then in 1776, Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, and his idea was comparative advantage. He said, I'm more or less against tariffs. And everybody will be richer with no tariffs. So the countries that can produce the cheapest tobacco will have that market. The countries that can produce the cheapest printing presses will have that market. And everybody will benefit. And so this idea bounced around a lot, particularly in Britain, where free trade was really touted. All kinds of events took place. Things went back and forth. And in the U.S., the idea of tariffs was really a contributing cause, in a way, for the Civil War, because the government raised its revenue by tariffs, and the people that benefited from the tariffs were northern states. The people that paid the tariffs allegedly were southern states, or planters, or people that had farms and no manufacturing. And indeed, it almost caused the secession of South Carolina in 1862. Okay, so the numbers go back and forth. Income taxes are put in transitorily in the Civil War. Okay, you can't do income taxes. So for a long while, until the early 20th century, when income taxes were, a constitutional amendment was put through making income taxes okay. So that the preponderant amount of money started to be generated by income taxes. And then when the Great Depression happened, famously, the budget was balanced. We're going to balance the budget, and we're also going to impose tariffs. And what that did was it basically diminished the demand for goods. I mean, things were more expensive. People couldn't afford things, and the velocity of money decreased, and that encouraged the Depression. So there's a big idea about tariffs being something that's bad. And then particularly after World War II, great efforts were undertaken to really diminish tariffs. And there have been a number of mechanisms that have happened. The countries have gotten together. The general idea is that the tariffs are counterproductive. That's the general idea. Now, and there have been a number of efforts, quote, to make things fairer. And it could be said that, and I think you've got some figures about this, the U.S. has been running a trade deficit. So we buy more than we sell, basically, and year after year, that's mounted up. And apparently, one of the things going on is this money is recirculated into buying our bonds and sort of maintaining the value of the dollar, and a lot of dollars floating around. So we have a complicated world arrangement that exists now with the U.S. in the middle of all this, not running a trade deficit. And then it recently, President Trump basically said, and it's hard to know all the nuances of this, but this is not right. We need to do something, and let's erect some tariffs, and therefore we'll stop, almost like an 18th century idea, we'll stop running deficits, and presumably also we'll get tax revenue, and our domestic economy will improve. That's at least the hope for this. Now, that's sort of, at least from my point of view, a springboard for some of the discussion. And I know you have your spin on that, and I'll maybe give you the football, and maybe you could discuss this.
All right, yeah. So you've covered some of what I want to talk about first, but what is a tariff, right, at its core, right? They are taxes levied on imported goods, right? They are only paid by the importer at the moment of importation, and the importers tend to pass these costs along to consumers through higher prices, right? If it costs if something is sold to an importer for $1.50 and they want to maintain, let's say, a 50-cent profit on that $1.50, they'll sell it to a consumer for $2, right? So you get higher price with tariffs, and these serve an important purpose, right? These were the primary form of tax revenue for most governments until the 20th century. Until income tax was established in 1913, tariffs accounted for 90% of the federal government's tax revenue. They served a very important economic function. And their purpose was relatively noble, at least to start, right? They're to make imported foreign-produced goods more expensive in order to make domestically produced goods more competitive, and thus ideally more desirable by consumers, right? If you have people really importing, let's say you're trying to establish an American beer industry, and you have to compete with Britain and Germany, you want to make sure that British and German beers are more expensive to import, and so people are more likely to drink the nascent American beer, right? That industry is able to get off the ground. This is also really important for very marginal industries like agriculture, where the profit is very low in terms of the price to sell versus what it costs to produce, right? And so mercantilism, you talked about, was designed to make sure that these industries were protected, and also to make sure that industries that are vital to the national interest, right? The defense industry is a huge one that we still have very highly protectionist policies around today, are protected. So they serve a very important role, right? You want to make sure that because of the various issues of global trade, which is an incredibly complex arrangement, right? Whether that's cheaper labor in other countries, competitive advantage, right? Economies of scale, that your country's industries have a fighting chance. And for most of human history, we tried to keep, as you said, right, exports greater than imports. That's the goal. Fortunately, since 1976, the United States has run a consistent trade deficit, right? Which is where a country imports more than it exports, right? We just are simply buying more than we are selling out, right? And in 2024, this was a value of $773 billion, right? That's nothing to shake a stick at. That's a good amount of money. And most of that money, about a third of it, some $279 billion, is a result of a negative balance of trade with China. China does not buy a lot of American goods. We buy a lot of things made in China, right? An important thing to distinguish about tariffs, too, is that they don't affect, they don't care necessarily who owns the products that are being made. American companies that have factories in China have those products affected by tariffs on Chinese products. The tariff goes on products of a given location where it's produced from. It does not necessarily care about the owner. So this is something that affects multinational corporations particularly. And so there's not kind of like a loophole where American companies are kind of getting out of this. Now, the purpose of that, like the advantage of that system, is such that it's ideally supposed to encourage, right, American industry to return back to the United States and discourage, spreading out capital investments around the world, particularly when it comes to labor and the like. These trade deficits often lead to an argument that we're being ripped off. Right? Well, they're not buying as much stuff. Why are we selling them stuff and, letting them take advantage of us? And that leads to a lot of well-deserved popular anger. But the answer to that question of are we getting ripped off is almost unquestioningly no, right? For a couple reasons. One, right? Trade deficits are actually a strong consumer economy most of the time. Now, when they get really massive, and like exports are very tiny compared to imports, then you might have a problem. It means you're not producing enough, or maybe your goods aren't high enough quality to be exported, right? But we export a lot of stuff. We just buy a lot of things. And that means that we have a lot of people in this country who want to buy things, who have the cash on hand to buy things, right? For a long time, foreign goods were seen as kind of the luxury option, right? You had, let's take cars, right? You have your standard run-of-the-mill, good old American Ford, right? If you wanted to buy a German car, that's a luxury, right? That's seen as like a status symbol. And so if you can afford to buy that foreign-made car, you have a strong enough socioeconomic position to do that, right? So high imports is a sign of a strong economy. The other reason we're not really getting ripped off is the nature of what we're importing. The vast majority of our trade deficit is due to energy imports, primarily oil. If you remove oil from the equation, we actually run a trade surplus. It is a ton of money that we are spending on importing oil, right? That's the price we pay for cheap gas prices. We could go energy independent. We could do that. That would reduce energy independence, right? That great buzzword since the 70s, would reduce our trade deficit dramatically. But we have opted, for various economic reasons, not to pursue that hyper-aggressively, right?
So maybe I can jump in a little bit.
Yeah.
These are the arguments that are being touted about, or maybe they're not. And one thing that makes me suspicious always are words like ripped off or pejorative terms without numbers behind them. And there's a lot of complexities that go on in the world economic order right now, a lot of complexities. And I think we're getting into the amount of money that this, to me, is, these numbers are what ought to be thought about. And you're going through some of the issues here, but apparently, at least it's extremely difficult to get numbers. It's complicated. But if you're sitting here and you're an American wherever you are, and is this good, is this bad? And it appears that a lot of bad things are happening now. We'll go through the litany of a lot of bad things. Are there some good things happening? Well, allegedly, I think, who can say, but the numbers would be $100 billion in money would come to the government. $100 billion would come there. And we could say that $100 billion coming into the government's coffers would be referable to a tax on consumption. It's a consumption tax. And getting the $100 billion in there, are there any sort of other numbers out there? And this is the number that I think, that firstly, I don't believe that's an incredibly large number.
It is
in the $17 billion economy, or a trillion rather, the gross economy is a huge, huge number. And if you look at the world economics, it's a really, really, really small number. So doing all this is not particularly going to produce any extraordinary amount of money. And what we can see right now, just after this has occurred, is that we have about a $3 trillion drop in the stock market, the value of the stock market. So if you're saying, well, I have my 401k, or I do this, or I do that, or I work for, let's say, a construction company, I'm employed with a construction company, and the construction company is bringing timber in from Canada, and they need this to make their numbers. They need this, and the company needs to make a profit for me to have my job. Well, it looks like that's not happening. There's a tremendous decrease in the value of American companies, tremendous, really a frightening increase as a starter. So just to me, the one thing to do is, what about the numbers? And it looks like basically about a 30 times more loss than what we're getting just on economic terms alone for whatever else is happening. And then getting into the whole nuance of what exactly we're doing, these incredible, well, we can talk about this. This policy, in my opinion, there can be an argument for tariffs sometimes. There can be an argument for them for different reasons. You mentioned defense story. So maybe we need to maintain defense issues. You could make the case maybe with computer chips. Maybe there's some kind of deal about that, whatever. Our technology, maybe we should have import restrictions. There are all kinds of ways that the country can protect its intellectual and capitalist, resources. Well, okay, so the numbers are bad, and then there are a huge number of secondary problems that we can start to talk about besides the numbers.
Yes.
All right, okay, so we have this terrible deal. Let me repeat this. As best I can determine it, it is a terrible deal. It could be in the world order right now that countries have put tariff policies on board around the world. And you could say, well, it means that it's a throwback to 18th century mercantilism. Okay, so they're going to wind up with a capital surplus. China is winding up with a large capital surplus. So they're sending stuff here, and there's a tariff policy that I'm not sure we've parsed that out tremendously, but there may be barriers to getting American products into China. Thus, there's a problem, a trade problem. And what basically is happening is this enormous national debt, which is caused by the fact that we can't balance our budget. We don't want to extract tax revenue, and we want to continue to spend huge amounts of money in the U.S., preponderantly for social services or diminishing the recirculating money to help people, I guess, on the other end of the rainbow. People need health care, maybe they need some kind of money from the government or whatever they need. So that's a lot of money going there. A lesser amount, it goes to defense, a lesser amount. Social Security, big numbers, et cetera, all these big numbers that are out there. And the taxes are not heavy enough to take care of this. So the government is borrowing money and printing money. And the way that's happening is this money is being recirculated from China. They're buying our bonds, although they've diminished that. So other countries basically buy U.S. debt, and that keeps things working. So it's like a circulation of the money. So it could be said that we're having all these big, huge losses and this and that, but it could be said this is inevitable with these, it's an impact of the year after year of the disjunction between what the government spends and what it receives in taxes. So that's a card in the deck. It's a complicated kind of card. But certainly right now, what's going on, this particular strategy is having tremendous difficulties. And it's not the way to do it, if I can phrase it that way. But why don't you keep going with your comments here?
Yeah, no. So we've covered kind of the benefits to some degree. We haven't yet defined right what the policies are. So what are, in terms of numbers, right? We are talking now 25% tariffs on virtually all Canadian and Mexican goods. The exception is energy, i.e. oil, which is tariffed at 10%. So still a 10% increase. Mexico and Canada are our two largest trade partners in the world. Canada is our largest receiver of exports. It's our number one export partner. These economies are heavily linked together, particularly since free trade agreement signed with NAFTA right in the 90s. We've got 30 years of integration economically between them. There have been increased Chinese tariffs that we talked about, doubling our tariff rate. We went from 19% to 39% virtually overnight. And then the new tariff that just came out this week that's going to be a killer is a 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum imports. That is going to be dramatic, right? In terms of the benefits from that, right, you mentioned $100 billion. That's just from tariffs on Canada and Mexico. So there are going to be extra tax revenues that come from that. We're going to see more than just $100 billion in revenue from that. That's a huge benefit, right? Ideally, that will, in terms of advantages that come from these plans, it makes American industry more competitive. It makes America need to be taken. It says that America is going to be taken seriously on the world stage, right? You don't dictate trade terms to us. We dictate trade terms to you. I mean, I personally think it's a bit of a return to 19th century kind of economic bullying, but there is something to be said for economic power, right? And for stating that.
Now, Harry, I understand you're making some very erudite points here. Just to summarize sort of where things are going, we're trying to come up with a risk-benefit ratio
Yes.
of what's happening with this policy. And there's some confusion about what's really going on, and I'm making the case that there's a $3 trillion drop in stock market values. And it's really, really spooky because this was pretty much unnecessary. This is a particular, you could say, looming recession or depression that's absolutely government caused, with the idea there's an effort underway to correct what's seen as a capital disjunction in the world. And we don't have any numbers to explain what exactly is going on or what's up, and they're all a whole litany of things that, from another point of view, are against U.S. interests. In fact, it is hard to find something that favors U.S. interest in doing this. Certainly, we've estranged ourselves from all kinds of allies. The world order has been tremendously disturbed by this. And the world leadership for the U.S. has been diminished. Along with that, our moral viewpoints. So you could say, well, our moral viewpoints, whatever they are, they're sort of a combination of, I would say, Christianity and different ethics opinions and just the moral mistakes the country may have made in the past, the self-corrections occurring, the idea of Superman, truth, justice, the American way, whatever. That's a very powerful thing to say, and the tariff issue is causing all kinds of difficulties. But other countries, you want to discuss that or
Yes.
take it whichever way you'd like?
So, I mean, these tariffs have very real impact for Americans, but I mean, even just on other countries, they're going to be incredibly damaging. The last major set of tariffs we had in the world were the Smoot-Hawley tariffs of 1931 when they were signed. And that inevitably, between 1931 and 1934, because it sparked a series of retaliatory tariffs around the world and ended a brief free trade experiment that had been started in 1913, global trade contracted by 66%. Massive, devaluation of the global economy, and made the depression, way, way worse.
And possibly contributed to causing World War II.
Yes, absolutely, because Japan got caught up in this. It helped cut Japan off from
right.
resources. It encouraged German expansionism and the pursuit of autarky. That's the kind of stuff that we have to look at as a cautionary tale. And with retaliatory tariffs already being promised, Canada is going to levy another $20 billion in retaliatory tariffs on us. That's going to come with some pain. And we are going to get it from both sides in that regard. Other countries are going to say that, if the goal of these tariffs, right, is to increase U.S. exports, that's one of the things of saying, hey, we want to reduce this imbalance. We're going to minimize imports or make, by disincentivizing importation of goods. And we're going to weaken the dollar enough that exports become easier and more attractive. And we get that kind of middle ground. retaliatory tariffs nullify that argument instantly because exports become more expensive and less attractive, and you still get the weakened dollar.
The other thing to remember about this is that you might make some case that this is going to help the U.S. somehow. You can make that case. But the other shoe to drop is what happens to other countries. So presumably, other countries are going to be injured by this, and many fragile countries that have a tough time making it. They're going to have a preponderantly more nip than we would receive, and those aggrieved countries, a normal thing that happens is I'm exaggerating slightly. There may be famine, and its evil satanic brother war happens. So we mentioned World War II and the Depression. If there is, if this really does provoke some terrible world economic catastrophe, with the world being the way it is, you could expect other things to take place, and particularly the idea of the U.S. being cast as a villain worldwide. So if you thought there was going to be some kind of way that we wanted to do, we want to put some tariffs in there. We want to do that. Well, when we do it, we're going to have to pay attention to what the other impacts are. And there could be a very strong argument if you thought the U.S. would be ripped off by Canadian milk producers, which is really quite a de minimis kind of thing. Well, that's not too much. It's not much. Now, the other thing that's out there, which is of consequence in this whole discussion, is the VAT. So apparently the U.S. government is considering VAT as a kind of tariff, which is quite, and VAT for people in the audience is the taxes the European Union charges on consumption, which is extremely high. It's about 20%, I believe, for many things. Very high consumption. And people might say, well, this is a very non-progressive tax. You could also probably say this about tariffs. The way that the taxes that are being paid, it's complicated, but it is likely going to fall on less prosperous parts of our society. They're going to get more of a nip. I guess if you buy a Mercedes, whatever, well, all right, you get a little nip there too. Nevertheless, it has all these unintended economic consequences, and I particularly don't like the idea of negotiating with Canada or negotiating with, let's say, the European Union. Well, what are your tariffs? We're going to go through a tariff conversation here. You tax our tariffs are 2% or whatever they are, and yours are 10%. Well, actually, they're actually 30% because we're tossing in the VAT. So you're going to have to really change your whole tax arrangement. We're going to come into your world and say you've been earning money this way, but you can't do that anymore because it's going to cause a tariff war because we're including the VAT in this tax arrangement. And even though everybody, all the domestic producers in European countries pay that, I mean, we've decided we're going to put that in the equation. And finally, trying to get some idea about what these numbers are. The American person, the American voter, the American citizen needs to understand whatever's going on with these numbers. Yeah. We really need some number discussion.
Let's talk some numbers then. Let's talk some real numbers. So first, let's talk about aluminum and steel, right? When I said those tariffs are going to be killers, there's a reason for that. One, 15% of all steel used in the United States is imported, right? So 15% of everything we use from battleships to ladders comes from somewhere else and is going to be hit with a 25% tariff. 80% of all aluminum is imported, right? And we use aluminum for everything. That means your beer is going to get 25% more expensive, at least.
They put aluminum and beer?
Aluminum cans.
Aluminum cans.
Your can of Miller Lite is going to get 25% more expensive,
can we switch
at least.
The box
your can
bottles?
of Coke is going to get 25% more expensive. Your can of soup is going to get at least 25% more expensive.
More plastic. Right, okay.
Yeah, more plastic, right? So we're going to create a nightmare of a waste problem. Aluminum is at least expensive. Most aluminum that the United States produces is already recycled. We don't actually produce much aluminum domestically. We import it raw, manufacture it, then we recycle what we have and then resell it. And because of these tariffs, we're looking at an additional $22 billion into costs of steel imports alone, right? Steel-derived products, an additional $29 billion in cost of derivative products from aluminum, right? $29 billion extra that's going to have to be paid by U.S. consumers in that regard. On a personal note, my father designs planetariums and stuff around the world. He's got a project right now that he's working on in Jackson, Mississippi that was getting ready to go to bid. They bid it for $320,000 for this dome, which is 99% aluminum, 1% steel, right? So entirely hit by these tariffs. Now they're having to renegotiate the contract because of these tariffs, because the dome takes 9 months to build once it's ordered, so they have to order all the raw materials and stuff in there. The producer has agreed to only account for the cost of increase of raw materials. He's going to keep labor costs the same. He's not going to raise anything else. He's not going to make any additional money except for the cost of materials. They've now had to up the bid to at least $350,000.
Yes,
and that means that the city has to go back and fundraise. The taxpayers of Jackson, Mississippi, are now going to be on the hook for $30,000 extra dollars because of this one policy.
Well, of course, one of the issues going on is people are nervous about inflation. This should, although if the country closes down, maybe it'll have the converse effect. If there's nobody working anymore.
Except here's the issue. Inflation is not an increase in the supply of money. Inflation is a decrease in purchasing power of a dollar. How much can $1 buy? Now, increasing the supply of money does that. That's the most common way we get inflation, is you have too many dollars floating around, $1 becomes worthless comparatively, right? It's a decrease in purchasing power. But when you add on taxes like this, and you add on unnecessary expenditures that artificially decrease the purchasing power of a dollar, because now, without any change in production and input and the supply of money, $1 no longer buys.
Right. The other point about it is the velocity of money. So it's just like the Depression happened, whatever, things were allegedly more expensive, whatever, purchasing, but the velocity, people become frightened about spending money, and that's sort of one of the things going on now about stock market. And so the rough weather that's out there, the stormy seas, are causing people to not consume as much, for better or worse, and then that causes some angst in the country, which is we just keeping everyone happy and tranquil is always a difficult task, and these economic disjunctions that are happening, along with all the other policy arrangements that are out there, are certainly stirring the pot substantially. And the other thing to mention here is who knows what all this will do. And I mentioned putting plastic bottles in instead of aluminum. And so presumably all kinds of things will take place. And certainly one of the big ones would be not to spend money. You'd say if things are increased and this is costing a lot and this and that, that's going to be a big deal. Now, I think this needs to be said as we conclude a little bit, is are there some arguments for this? And I've heard this one espoused. Is that, we want to restore in the Rust Belt these mill arrangements, you could say that, mill towns possibly, where everybody has a job, they go to work, they hunt deer, like the deer slayer, they're out there doing whatever, they're happy, everybody has a good job in the factory, and that's sort of the idea, we're going to do that. And if that were to happen, presumably, if people had gainful, happy employment, the domestic arrangements would be better, there wouldn't be as many divorces, or families would be more stable, and there also might be some male jobs out there. So the drug addicted person that's that doesn't have a job, he's sort of unhappy male, he can't do his work, is not there for him, and restoring everything would ideally stop drug consumption. People would be, this is the idea about it. Now, having said that, this is the idea, that doesn't seem to be a very practical
It's not only practical, it's impossible. Those jobs are never coming back.
Well, I think,
and the reality is, too, let's talk about this. Let's say that it is possible to come back. In order to completely redo the system of global manufacturing that's put in place
Yes,
over the
right.
last 30 years would take years and billions of dollars of investments by private companies. By the time those were done, the political fortune will have changed. These tariffs will be gone. It is cheaper on the behalf of companies, and it is in the interest of private industry to just donate to the opposition, in this case the Democrats, I guess at this point, get them, have a sweep in the midterms, and have the tariffs removed. It's cheaper to do that than it is to completely bring all this stuff back. The profit motive of capitalism is going to make sure that these tariffs don't work in that intended way. It's a pipe dream. It's an admirable pipe dream, but it's a pipe dream nonetheless. And anything that makes a can of beer more expensive in the hope of trying to bring back jobs that are not going to come back is just going to make more Americans disillusioned, hurt more people, and make us poorer and not wealthy.
Well, we could keep going. Our time is about up. I would say this: numbers, numbers, numbers. Not say we're ripped off. Don't say that the milk costs whatever it is. The milk is this. It's some kind of thing. If looking at the tremendous economic arrangements that are out there, it's far more complicated, and this is a quite blunt tool to do it. And a tactical retreat should be something that is considered. So if you're a policymaker and you have a sense this is not going to work, there's no shame in pulling back. And I hope that the policymakers will, if they can sense this policy is not working, they'll have the good sense to alter it. And it could be some kind of lesser arrangement that goes forward somehow. We could find smaller things to discuss, or we could have a world conference about it. We could have a great world arrangement. And I hope that what's going on at putting this policy there was some kind of, this is a negotiatory arrangement. I hope that's the case. But this is not going to go on much longer without a catastrophe. So, okay, well, thank you.
Agreed.
All right, well, thanks so much for being with us tonight, Harry.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.